Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 10 of the most disturbing true ghost ship stories ever sent in to this channel. Sailors, salvage divers, and lighthouse keepers sent these in. And these aren't campfire inventions. Too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We cross-checked the details, and they line up with Coast Guard logs, Port Authority records, and marine insurance files. Before we start, a taste of what's coming. An insurance investigator assigned to prove a crew staged their own vanishing, who ends up unable to explain any of it. A diver called out for what should have been a routine tow, finding the crew gone without a single sign of a struggle, the boat still running like someone just stepped away, and a quarantine officer boarding a liner that drifted in 4 days late, radio silent, to find the ship spotless, meals still plated, and not one soul aboard. 10 stories, 10 ships. Not one body ever found. Subscribe, turn the bell on. This channel is about slow-burning, authentic horror over cheap jump scares. And if you've got your own story, drop it in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. All right, cut the cabin light. Let's start with the one that started it all, the Mary Celeste. I was hired to prove the crew staged their own disappearance, and I couldn't. Before you decide how this ends, I want you to sit with one number, 10. 10 people were on that ship when it left New York Harbor, and 10 people were gone when it was found still sailing itself across open water, with nothing broken, nothing burned, and nothing stolen. Keep that number in your head. Everything I found either explained it or made it worse, and I'm still not sure which one you're about to hear. The file came to me the way these things always do. From an underwriter who needed a clean answer and a policy he could either pay or deny. December 1872. The brigantine Dei Gratia had come across a ship under partial sail. Cargo intact, no crew. The ship was the Mary Celeste. Captain, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, 7 hands. Gone. My job wasn't to solve it. My job was to find the version of events that got the insurer off the hook. I didn't know yet that the file would outlast 3 other cases on my desk, or that I'd still be turning it over in my head a year later, off the clock, on my own time, because a version that fit never showed up. Fraud was the first theory, and it was the one they wanted most. A captain and crew who vanish, a ship that turns up intact, a payout that follows. It writes itself. So I started there. I went through the cargo manifest line by line. 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, still lashed in the hold. 6 months of food and water untouched. The captain's wife had left her jewelry in a drawer, and her sewing machine bolted to the floor of the cabin, needles still in the fabric. There was a bill of exchange worth real money, sitting untouched in the captain's desk, and nobody had so much as opened the drawer. Men who fake their own disappearance for profit don't leave the profit behind. I closed that file inside of 2 days, but closing it raised a question I couldn't put down. If this wasn't staged, then everything left behind was left in a hurry, and a hurried departure from an undamaged ship is a stranger thing to explain than a planned one. Mutiny came next, because it always does when a captain and crew go missing together. I pulled the hiring records. Briggs handpicked every man on that ship. He'd sailed with 2 of them before. His first mate, Albert Richardson, held part ownership in the vessel. A man doesn't burn down a ship he owns a share of. Nothing in the log read like a captain, managing a crew he didn't trust. No warnings, no punishments recorded, no short rations. Nothing that reads like tension building toward a mutiny. I want to tell you about the sword next, because for a few hours, it looked like the answer to everything. But hold on to the missing instruments too. I'll come back to those, and when I do, they're going to undercut the sword completely. The sword turned up under the captain's bunk, and someone on the salvage crew swore the blade had what looked like dried blood on it. For about 4 hours I thought I had my answer. A fight on deck, a body over the rail, a story an insurer could actually use. I sent it to a chemist. He scraped the residue, ran it, and told me flatly it was rust, nothing else. That was the second time that week I watched a clean explanation die under testing. And it wouldn't be the last. Piracy was worth an afternoon, no more. Pirates don't leave 1,700 barrels of alcohol worth more than the ship itself sitting in the hold. They don't leave a captain's silver behind either, and they don't leave the ship in sailing condition when they could have taken it and sold it whole. Here's where the case should have gotten easier, and instead it got harder. I checked the ship's inventory against what the salvage crew actually found on board, and two things were missing that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with navigation: the chronometer and the sextant. A pirate doesn't want those. A mutineer doesn't need those. But a man abandoning ship in a hurry, trying to keep track of where he is once he's off it, wants exactly those two things. So did the ship's papers, and the captain's logbook slate, the daily working notes, not the official log, which was still on board. Someone had taken the tools you'd need to survive being lost at sea, and left everything you'd need to get rich. That single fact killed piracy, killed mutiny, and made fraud look almost sensible again for about an hour, until I remembered the jewelry in the drawer. I checked the weather logs against 3 other vessels that crossed the same stretch of Atlantic that week. Calm, no storm violent enough to strip a crew off a seaworthy ship and leave the ship standing. I want to be honest about how much time I spent on this, because it's the theory the newspapers liked best, and it's the one I could disprove the fastest and the most completely. A seaquake, a waterspout, a sudden squall. None of it matches a ship still under sail, still on a plausible heading, still upright, still dry below decks, except for one detail I hadn't gotten to yet. By then, the underwriter's patience was thinning, and I understood why. So I looked at the 2 captains instead of the ship. Briggs and the Dei Gracia's captain, Morehouse, had dined together in New York the night before both vessels sailed. Same port, same route, ships crossing the same ocean days apart. An insurer hears that and smells collusion immediately. I did too, for a while. I went through Briggs's finances expecting to find debt, a reason to disappear, a reason to split a salvage payout with a friend. I found the opposite. He'd sunk 1/3 of his own savings into this voyage. A man doesn't stage a disappearance with his own money, his wife, and his infant daughter on board. That should have closed the collusion angle for good. It didn't, not entirely, because it meant 2 captains had genuinely, coincidentally, crossed paths on the same water days apart. And coincidence is the one thing an insurance file is never allowed to accept as an answer. The cargo told me something the logs hadn't, and this is the detail I asked you to remember. 9 of those 1,701 barrels came up empty, or badly leaking when the hold was finally unloaded. Cheaper red oak, more porous than the white oak the rest of the shipment was packed in. Vapor collecting in a closed hold, in warm weather, off 9 leaking barrels of raw alcohol, is not a small thing on a wooden ship in 1872. 1 spark, 1 open flame below decks, and that hold doesn't burn slowly. A man 20 years at sea doesn't sit on that risk once he smells it. I kept turning that fact over for weeks before I understood what it actually explained, and what it didn't. So I went back to the timeline, and that's where the case actually broke open, just not in the direction anyone wanted. The last entry in the official log was dated the 25th of November, near Santa Maria Island. The ship was found on the 4th of December, roughly 400 nautical miles further along its course. I ran the math against wind and current for that stretch of ocean, and an unmanned ship, sails set the way they were, does not cover that distance on its own. Somebody was still adjusting canvas, still correcting heading, for at least part of those 9 days. Sit with that for a second, because it changes the whole shape of the question. Whatever happened to this crew didn't happen all at once on the 25th. It happened in stages, and somebody was alive and working that ship after the last log entry was ever written down. That changed what I was looking for. I went back over the rail and found what the salvage report had noted, but nobody had followed up. A length of rope, frayed at the end, still fastened near the stern, running out over open water where the missing yawl should have been. Not cut clean. Frayed like it had been under tension and pulled apart. That's not what you find after a launch. That's what you find after something was being towed. I sat with that a long time before I let myself write it down. A captain smelling vapor rising out of a hold he can't ventilate fast enough, doesn't panic. He moves his family and his crew into the yawl, keeps them tied off close behind the ship, and waits for the hold to clear before deciding whether to reboard. Not abandonment, a precaution, made by a competent man protecting his wife and his daughter from a risk He understood better than any of us reconstructing it a year later. And then the wind came up, or the swell did, and a rope already frayed once gave out completely, and a ship with nobody steering it kept sailing away from 6 people and 4 hands it was never supposed to leave behind. I couldn't prove that. I want to be clear about that part, because the underwriter asked me to be clear about it too, several times, with less patience each time. I had a theory that fit the physical evidence better than fraud, better than mutiny, better than piracy or storm. I did not have a body, a witness, or a log entry that confirmed any part of it. An insurance report needs confirmation. It doesn't pay out on the theory that best survives cross-examination. So they pushed me toward fraud again, because fraud lets them deny the claim, and I told them I couldn't sign a finding I didn't believe. That cost me the next 2 contracts with that underwriter. I filed what I actually had, a case that could not be reconstructed with certainty, built on evidence that ruled out every theory anyone wanted, and confirmed none of the ones anyone could live with. The last thing I read before I closed the file was the final log entry itself, the one from the 25th. I'd been circling it for weeks, expecting something, a note of worry, a mention of the cargo, anything that would tell me they'd seen it coming. There isn't one. It records a position, a heading, fair weather, nothing more. Whatever came for that crew came without warning, in the middle of an ordinary morning, while somebody on deck was doing exactly what he'd done every morning before it. Ship's log. Brigantine Mary Celeste, 8 o'clock, the 25th of November. Position fixed 6 miles east-southeast of Santa Maria Island. Wind moderate, out of the west-southwest. All sail set, course holding steady. Albert Richardson calling the numbers out to whoever's got the slate. Nothing to remark on, nothing to log beyond the figures. Sophia's laugh carrying up from the cabin below. Sarah Briggs on deck for the air. The captain checking his sightings against the chart one more time before he goes below to check the hold himself. The way he's checked it every morning since New York. Routine. Just routine. Someone's already reaching for the ventilation hatch, and there is no reason, not yet, for anyone on that deck to think this morning is any different from the one before it. We picked up the call on a frequency reserved for emergencies only, and it did not sound like any emergency we'd trained for. I was 26, sitting third watch on a merchant vessel running cargo through the Strait of Malacca, headphones clamped so tight against my skull that my ears ached by the end of every shift, and I remember the exact second the tone on that channel changed, because we were taught to listen for a pattern, and this call broke the pattern before it even properly started. Regulation said the first thing out of a distress call was the ship's name, spoken clear, repeated twice. This one skipped that entirely. The voice on the other end was already mid-sentence, like a man who had been shouting into an open line for longer than we'd managed to catch. The words that came through clean were also the worst kind of clean. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room, the voice said. Possibly whole crew dead. I wrote it down because that is the job, word for word. No guessing at the parts you can't hear. You leave the gaps as gaps, and let the silence sit on the page exactly where it happened. Then, less than 2 minutes later, before I'd even finished logging the time of the first message, the same channel opened again, and what came through this time wasn't a correction. It was worse. Now it wasn't the officers dying somewhere out of frame. Now the voice was tapping out 2 words about himself. I die. Somewhere between those 2 transmissions, the operator on the other end stopped using English. What came through was a short burst, 4 or 5 words, clipped and foreign, and then it dropped back into English, the way a man switches which hand he's writing with. My chief, who had 20 years on the wireless and had heard every kind of panicked operator there was, pointed out something that never made it into any official account. The rhythm of the key changed partway through. Not just the language, the touch, as if 2 different men had taken turns at the same set of dots and dashes, one after the other, each one running out of whatever he had left before he could finish saying it. Then it stopped. Not a fade, not a sign-off. Stopped. Mid-word. The way a man's voice stops when something closes around his throat mid-sentence. I sat there with the headphones still on for what felt like a long time, waiting for the carrier wave to come back the way it sometimes does, 30 seconds later, on a slightly different frequency. It never came back. The last thing on my sheet, in my own handwriting, was a word cut off after 2 letters. And to this day, I don't know if it was the start of a name, a position, or a man's last attempt to finish a sentence for whoever was listening. Our captain took the position I'd logged, laid it against the chart, and didn't much like what he found, because we were the nearest vessel in that stretch of water by a wide margin. Inside 20 minutes, we'd come about, and were making full ahead toward it. I stood on the bridge wing and watched the horizon shift, and understood, in a way I hadn't a half hour earlier, that whatever I'd typed onto that sheet of paper wasn't someone else's problem to solve anymore. We raised her a little after 10 the next morning, sitting dead in flat, calm water. No way on her. Funnel cold, no smoke. The first thing our navigator noted, and noted with some irritation, was that she wasn't anywhere near where the original call had placed her. Ships drift, currents move, but the distance between the reported position and the one where we actually found her was more than current alone could account for in that short a window, and nobody on our bridge had a clean explanation for it. We ran up signal flags and sounded the horn and got nothing back. No light, no flare, no man topside waving his arms, which by itself should have told us something, because a ship in real trouble almost always has somebody looking for rescue. Her lifeboats were still sitting in the davits, every one of them. Whatever had come for that crew had come too fast, or too completely, for a single man to try getting off. 4 men crossed in a boat. I wasn't one of them, but I had the account inside the hour, because 2 of the 4 couldn't stop talking about it, and the other 2 couldn't say a word. They found the captain on the bridge on his back, arms thrown up like he was warding something off from above. The mate was in the chart room in the same posture. The engineers below, the same. No blood anywhere. No burns, no wounds. Nothing broken. Nothing knocked over that would suggest a fight or a struggle. Every mouth on that ship was still open. There was a dog, too. A small brindle thing kept on a short chain near the galley, and it was dead in the same posture as the men, on its back, legs drawn tight to its body. One of the 4 told me that detail sat worse with him than any of the human dead, because a dog doesn't know how to perform fear for anybody's benefit. Whatever it saw in its last seconds, it saw plainly, with nothing between it and the thing itself. They collected what watches and clocks they could find around the ship, thinking the times might tell them something useful, and what they found only complicated the picture further. The clocks weren't stopped together. A pocket watch off the captain read a good 20 minutes different from the wall clock in the mess, which read different again from one found in a cabin below. Whatever had happened on that ship, it apparently hadn't happened to every man in the same instant, the way the scene up top had made it look. And yet, down in the engine spaces, they found the log open on its stand, the last entry broken off mid-sentence, the pen resting where the hand had let it fall. When somebody later lined that timestamp up against the last minute I'd logged on my own sheet, hundreds of miles distant, the 2 matched almost to the minute. 2 men, in 2 different places, on 2 different vessels, had each stopped writing at very close to the same moment, even while the clocks scattered around the freighter herself couldn't agree with one another at all. They went looking for a cargo manifest, because by then, everybody's mind had drifted toward something you could file away. A leak, a spoiled hold, some cargo that had turned toxic in the heat. There wasn't one, not damaged, not missing pages, simply not there, as if she'd cleared port without ever declaring what sat in her holds. When one of the men checked her papers against the name painted across her bow, Ourang Medan, they didn't agree either, and the discrepancy was strange enough that by the time anyone thought to press it further, there was no ship left to press it on. One of the 4 started feeling wrong while he was still below, lightheaded, his chest gone tight, and he came back up the ladder a good deal faster than he'd gone down it. He didn't lose consciousness, didn't collapse, but he'd gone pale enough that the other 3 cut the search short right there and got everybody back into the boat. I have turned that part over more than any other single detail from that day, because it's the one that suggests whatever took that crew might not have finished with the ship. It might still have been sitting in her somewhere, waiting on whoever came aboard next. Our captain still wanted her brought in, dead crew and all, because a freighter with her whole company gone and her manifest missing was worth considerably more tied up at a dock than left drifting for someone else to find. They got a line across and were working to make her fast when a man on deck called out that smoke was coming up out of the forward hold. Nobody had gone below with so much as a match. Nobody had a reason to. It went from smoke to open flame, faster than any of us thought a hull that size ought to burn, and inside the hour, it was clear she wasn't going to be saved, and wasn't going to be boarded again either. The order came to cut the tow before the fire could run the line back to us, and we stood off and watched her burn low in the water until, well after dark, she went down by the bow and didn't come back up. Whatever had been in that hold, whatever had taken that crew, went down with her, and not so much as a plank was ever recovered. I expected an inquiry in the weeks afterward, a proper one, our accounts checked against harbor records and insurance papers, and a customs file somewhere with her real cargo listed. What happened instead was closer to the opposite. When people went looking for her registration, the name on file didn't match any vessel cleared from the port she was supposed to have sailed out of. Different offices told different versions of the same night, and no two versions agreed on a flag, a date, or an owner, as though the paperwork had been built from the start to come apart the moment anyone leaned on it. I was asked to hand over my original log sheet, the one with the cut-off words still sitting at the bottom of it, and I did. But not before I sat up half that night copying it out by hand onto a second sheet I folded into my kit and told no one about. I've never fully worked out why I did that. I think some part of me already didn't trust that the original would survive contact with whoever was collecting the paperwork on this. And given how fast the official trail went cold, I don't think I was wrong not to trust it. Years on, when I ran into our own captain again at a port function and got him talking about that night, I noticed his account had shifted from what I remembered him saying at the time. Small things, the order the messages came in, how long we'd waited before altering course. I don't think he was lying to me. I think the story had simply been retold enough times, by him and by others, that it had started wearing into a smoother, easier shape, the way anything does with enough handling, the true edges rounding off a little more with each telling. I tried, later, to track down the other 3 men from that boarding party, thinking a second or third account might sharpen mine instead of smoothing it further. One had died at sea in an accident that had nothing to do with any of this, less than 2 years after. One never answered a single letter. The third wrote back exactly once, a short note saying he didn't see what good could come from picking it back up, and I never heard from him again after that. None of it proves anything was owed to be paid. Men who've seen what they saw often just want to be left with it, but it meant that as the years went on, I became the only one still willing to say, plainly, that it happened at all. It took me the better part of a decade to find anyone who could tell me what those foreign words might have meant, since I'd never had them recorded, only remembered, and tapped back out from memory onto paper. A Dutch harbor pilot I fell into conversation with in a bar in Rotterdam finally gave me something close to an answer. The phrasing, as best he could reconstruct it from my description, came out closest to "we are all dying," said plainly, without the grammar of panic in it, even though everything around it was panic. That changed how I understood the whole message. It wasn't a man losing his English in a moment of terror. It was a man switching, deliberately, to the language he trusted most, in the last clear minute he had, to make sure that whoever eventually picked this up understood exactly what was happening to him and his crew while it was still happening to them. I won't claim the years since have been free of it. For a long stretch after I left the sea for good, I'd wake around 3 in the morning with my jaw clenched tight enough to ache the next day, and more than once my wife told me she kept one photograph of him, and it's the only proof he was ever aboard at all. My great-great-grandmother, Agnes, carried it folded into a hymnal for 60 years, and when she died, it came to my grandmother, and then it came to me, and none of us ever really looked at it the way I've had to look at it these last 8 months. A man in a collarless shirt, soot still dark in the creases of his hands, standing in front of a hull he'd never sail again. His name was Thomas Veil. He was a stoker on a coal collier, called the Halcyon Grey, and in December of 1908, somewhere off the Nova Scotia coast, he stopped existing in any way the paperwork can account for. What I didn't know when I started pulling this apart is that the paperwork itself was going to turn out to be the whole problem. Not the storm, not the sea, the paperwork. I started this because my grandmother mentioned, almost in passing, over a kitchen table, that had nothing to do with any of this, that the family had never really believed the official story. She said it the way you mention a stain on a rug you've stopped seeing, something everyone in the house had agreed not to talk about for so long it had become furniture. That should have been the first thing that told me this wasn't going to be simple, but I didn't understand yet how far the crack went, or how many hands had been pressed against it trying to hold it shut. The official story is short, almost insultingly short for a man's whole life. The Halcyon Grey left Sydney Harbor loaded with coal bound for Halifax, ran into weather 2 days out, and never made port. Lost with all hands, 9 men, a line in a shipping ledger, and a line in a church register, and that was supposed to be the end of it. For 100 and some years it was the end of it, as far as any official record was concerned. But before I get to what actually happened, you need to understand what kind of man Thomas Veil was, because it matters later, more than I expected it to. He was 26. He'd been a stoker for 6 years by then, shoveling coal into a firebox in a space so hot the men worked in shifts of 4 hours, because anything longer and you'd collapse. He'd married a year before the voyage, a woman named Agnes, my great-great-grandmother, and by every account I could dig up, letters, a single surviving diary entry from a neighbor, he was not a reckless man. He was a man saving for a house. That detail matters. Hold on to it. The ship itself had made the same run a dozen times that year without incident. Coal out of Sydney, empty holdback. Coal out again. Routine enough that nobody in the family thought twice when he shipped out that December, even with the season turning ugly. There was a wireless operator aboard, unusual for a vessel that size, and the last transmission logged from the Halcyon Grey was sent 2 nights before she was due into Halifax. It said, as near as the surviving transcription records show, that all was well, and they expected to make port on schedule. Nothing about weather, nothing about trouble. I want you to remember that message, because it's going to come back around in a way that made my stomach turn when I finally understood it. Then the ship came back. Not wreckage, not a name painted on driftwood washing up weeks later. The whole hull, found drifting 11 days after that last wireless message, by a fishing schooner out of Louisburg, engines still turning over, coal bunkers half full, not a man aboard her, no bodies, no lifeboats missing. Every single lifeboat still on its davits. The galley table was set for a meal nobody ate. Plates down, nothing overturned. Like the men had simply stood up mid-supper and walked off the side of a moving ship into open water and vanished without a splash anyone recorded. That single fact rearranged everything I thought I understood about how a ship gets lost. A ship doesn't lose 9 men and keep running. The search party that boarded her found something else. Something that took me weeks of archive requests to even confirm existed, because it isn't in the official inquest file, it's in a private letter from one of the boarding officers to his brother, a letter that ended up in a regional historical society donation box decades later. He wrote that the ship's log had entries right up until 2 days before that final wireless message, and then nothing. Not torn pages, not water damage, just a clean stop, mid-voyage, with calm weather still logged in the last entry. No storm mentioned at all, and then a gap of 2 full days before the wireless operator sent word that all was well. Something happened in that gap. Something nobody wrote down, or something somebody erased. I went looking for the coroner's inquest expecting closure, and found the opposite. The inquest was opened in Halifax, heard 2 witnesses, a harbor pilot and a shipping company clerk, and was adjourned indefinitely for lack of evidence to determine cause. That word, indefinitely, sat wrong with me from the first time I read it. Inquests don't usually just stop. There was a 3rd witness scheduled, listed in the court's own docket by initials only, J.M. Never called, never explained, and no record of why. I still don't know who J.M. was. I've spent weeks trying to find out, and I haven't. That name sits in my notes like an open wound. Nobody was ever declared dead by a court, not formally. Not with a judge's signature on a finding of fact. They were declared dead by a shipping company that needed the file closed, and by an insurance payout that Agnes received 11 months later, oddly fast, for a claim with no verified loss behind it. No bodies, no wreck, no cause of death on record. I found the payout ledger in a provincial archive, and next to Thomas Veil's name was a note in different handwriting, added later, that just said, "Settled, no further correspondence." Someone wanted that file closed hard enough to write it twice. Then I found the dockworker's statement, filed but never called into the inquest, sitting loose in a folder that had clearly been reorganized at some point by someone who didn't think it mattered. A man loading coal in Halifax swore he'd seen someone matching Thomas's description walking off a berthed vessel 3 weeks after the Halcyon Grey was found empty. That the man had looked directly at him, and that Thomas had kept walking, not toward the harbor offices, not toward any authority, but away, into the streets behind the coal yards. The harbor authority dismissed him as unreliable, noted in the margin that he'd been drinking that shift. I don't think he was. I think somebody needed him to be unreliable. That's when the family rumor stopped feeling like folklore. My grandmother had one line she repeated from her own mother, half joke, half warning. The kind of thing said at the end of an evening when nobody wants to finish the thought out loud. He wasn't dead. He just didn't come home. I'd always heard it as bitterness, as the kind of thing a grieving widow's daughter says to make sense of a life that got smaller than it should have. Reading the inquest file, I started hearing it as testimony. I found the debt next, and this is where the story stopped being just sad and started being frightening. Thomas owed money in Sydney to a man named Corrigan, who ran credit for half the coal crews on that stretch of coast, the kind of debt that doesn't get collected through the courts, the kind that gets collected on a dock at night. I found a court record, unrelated on its surface, of a separate assault case against a man working for Corrigan, dated 4 months before the Halcyon Grey sailed. It doesn't mention Thomas, but it tells you what kind of collection this man ran, and it made me wonder for the first time whether a man saving for a house might also have been a man trying to disappear from something. I found a second stoker from that same voyage who also never resurfaced anywhere, in any later record. No death certificate, no remarriage, no grave. A man named Elias Doyle, 22 years old, unmarried, no family ever filing so much as an inquiry about him that I could find. 2 men, gone the same way, off a ship that came home running with the table still set. If it was just Thomas, I could believe in a man walking off a life that had gotten too heavy. 2 men missing the same way from the same ship makes it something else, makes it look planned. The Halcyon Grey herself was eventually broken up for scrap sometime in the 1920s, but part of her fittings went to a maritime salvage collection 2 provinces over, kept mostly for the historical curiosity of a ship with a story attached, and among them, still intact, 1 crew bunk. I went to see it. The wood was darker than I expected, worn smooth on the edges from 100 years of hands, and I stood there for a long moment before I even looked underneath, because some part of me already knew I wasn't going to like what I found. Scratched into the underside, where a man lying in it for years, or weeks, or however long, would have had nothing else to do with his hands, was a name. It wasn't Thomas Veil. It wasn't Elias Doyle. It wasn't any name on the 9-man manifest at all. It was a name I'd never seen in a single document connected to that ship. 3 letters and a surname I still won't say out loud on record, because I haven't been able to confirm who he was. Only that he existed, because the same surname turns up once, only once, in a Sydney parish register from that same year, with no occupation listed. I sat with that a long time before I understood what it meant, that somebody had been sleeping in that bunk who was never written down as being on that ship, which means the manifest itself was already a lie before the ship ever vanished. And if that's true, then lost with all hands was never really the question. The question was who was actually aboard her, and who wanted it to look like nobody survived, and whether the men whose names we do have were even the men who were supposed to be there in the first place. I went back to the shipping company's records after that, the parent company that owned the Halcyon Grey, and found something I still haven't been able to fully explain. Crews on that route weren't always signed on through the official union hall. There was a side practice, unofficial, never written into company policy, but referenced obliquely in 2 separate payroll disputes from other ships in the same fleet, of hiring men off the books for a run, paying cash, keeping them off the official manifest entirely, usually because it was cheaper, sometimes because the men themselves didn't want to be found. A ghost crew, riding alongside the documented one. If that practice existed on the Halcyon Grey too, then the ship that vanished wasn't carrying 9 men. It might have been carrying more. And whoever needed the file closed fast might have needed it closed precisely because a full accounting would have shown that. There's one more thing I haven't told anyone outside my own family, because I don't know what to do with it yet. Among Agnes's things, passed down with the photograph, there was a small ring, a man's ring, plain, not Thomas's wedding band, which she was buried with. Nobody in the family ever explained where it came from. My grandmother thought it might have belonged to Thomas's father. I had it looked at by a jeweler who does period appraisals, and he told me the engraving inside wasn't a date or initials at all. It was a route, a set of coordinates, worn nearly smooth, roughly matching a stretch of coast well north of where the Halcyon Gray was found drifting. I don't know who gave that ring to Agnes, or when, or why she kept it hidden in with a dead man's photograph for 60 years without a word to anyone. That's still an open door in this house, and I'm not ready to walk through it yet. I don't know if Thomas Veil drowned that December or walked off a different dock under a different name for the rest of his life, owing a debt he'd finally found a way to outrun. Agnes never remarried, never moved, kept that photograph folded in scripture like it might answer her one day, and maybe it did, in whatever quiet way a woman keeps a secret her whole life, without ever once writing it down. Maybe not knowing was its own kind of faithfulness. Maybe it was just the only thing she had left to hold on to. And maybe, and this is the part that keeps me up some nights, maybe she knew more than she ever let on, and the not knowing was mine, not hers. What I know now is that the Halcyon Gray wasn't the only ship on that coast with a story that didn't match its paperwork. Talking to an old harbor archivist in Louisburg, a man who'd spent 40 years cataloging wreck reports nobody else wanted to read, I mentioned the name of the ship, expecting nothing, and he just laughed, not unkindly, and said every fishing family north of Canso has a version of that story. A ship that comes back too clean, a crew that doesn't add up. He said the difference is that the ones the fishermen tell each other don't have a coroner's file attached, and they don't end with anybody's great-granddaughter crying in an archive with a ring she can't explain sitting in her coat pocket. They end differently, looser, older, passed around a wheelhouse instead of buried in a family Bible. And that's a story I want to go find next. Because if what happened to Thomas Veil wasn't unusual, if it was just one version of something that happened up and down that coast more than the official records ever admitted, then the Halcyon Gray isn't the whole story at all. It's just the one door in a very long hallway that happened to have my family's name on it. I've seen that ship 3 times in 30 years, always alone, always moving, not close enough to shake hands with a soul on her, because there's never been a soul on her, not once, not in 80 years, but close enough to know the paint, the rust running down her side like a bruise, the name on her bow scraped half off, and still readable if you know where to look. Bay Chimo. She was a fur trading steamer, built the same year my grandfather was, hauling pelts and supplies along the coast for the Hudson's Bay Company. 1931, she got locked in pack ice up past Barrow, and the company did what companies do, flew the crew out, wrote her off as a loss on the books, moved on. A storm was supposed to finish her a few weeks later. Word came back she'd gone under, and that should have been the end of it. Except a trapper spotted her the next winter, sitting up in the ice fields like nothing had touched her. Not broken, not sunk, just sitting there. That's the first thing that never sat right with anybody. A wooden hull, locked in pack ice for a season, ought to split open like a tin can under that pressure. She didn't. She never has. Men went looking for salvage after that. Plenty of them. Because a free ship is a free ship. One outfit even hired a pilot to land a plane on the ice next to her, meaning to tow her out come spring. Weather turned before they could rig the lines, and by the time it cleared, she was gone from where they'd left her. Not sunk. Gone. Moved 40 miles up the coast on her own, against the wind that was blowing that week, not with it. A steamer with no coal in her, no steam in her boilers, no reason to move at all, walked 40 miles against the weather like she had somewhere to be. I was 22 the first time I saw her myself, deckhand on my uncle's boat, running supplies before a storm that came in faster than the radio said it would. We ducked into a lee to ride it out, and there she was, sitting in broken ice not 200 yards off. No lights, no smoke, nothing. My uncle didn't even blink. Said her name like you'd say the name of a neighbor's dog. We rode over once the wind dropped, more curious than smart, and climbed up over her rail. Here's the thing, nobody tells you until you've been aboard her. She's not stripped, she's not rotted out. There were tins of food still sealed in the galley, charts still pinned open on the table in the wheelhouse, a coat still hanging on a hook by the door, like the man who wore it just stepped out for air. Dust everywhere, sure, and cold enough inside to keep your breath in front of your face. But nothing torn up, nothing scavenged by animals or time, the way you'd expect after decades. It felt less like a wreck and more like a house, where somebody had stepped out and meant to come right back. We took what men always take off her: cans of food, a coil of good rope, and my uncle told me the rule before we climbed back down. Take what you need and no more, and don't ever take her name in vain. I asked him why, and he just said there were men who'd taken more than their share off her and hadn't come home from their next trip out. I was young enough to think that was just talk to keep a nephew from getting greedy. I don't think that anymore. 11 years passed before I saw her again. Different stretch of coast entirely, near 200 miles from where I'd last laid eyes on her. And the currents up there don't run that direction. Not ever. Not in any season a fisherman could name. I checked the charts myself after, 3 times, because I didn't trust my own memory over something that big. There was no path of ice, no drift, no wind pattern that could carry a dead ship 200 miles against the current on her own. She'd gotten there some other way, and nobody could say what that way was. We boarded her again. A bigger crew that time, word having spread enough that half the men on the radio wanted to see her for themselves. And that's when the second thing happened, the thing that stuck with me longer than the ship moving ever did. A photograph that had been sitting upright on a shelf in the captain's quarters the first time I was aboard was now lying face down. Not fallen, not knocked over in a storm. Set down deliberately, the way you'd lay a photograph face down if you couldn't stand to look at it anymore. 11 years between visits, and somebody had touched that photograph. One of the older men with us that trip, a fellow who'd been aboard her twice before I was even born, went straight for the logbook in the wheelhouse, and when he found it, his hands weren't steady. It was open to a page dated 1931, the week the crew got airlifted out, and there was a name signed at the bottom in fresh ink, dark and unfaded, a name that matched a crewman listed on the original manifest as lost in the evacuation and never recovered. That log had been sitting shut, by every account, for over a decade. Somebody had opened it. Somebody had written in it. And the ink hadn't had time to fade the way 80-year-old ink should. There's a man from my father's generation, a cousin of his by marriage, who didn't believe in taking so little off her. He and 2 others stripped brass fittings and half a case of tools off the Bachimo one summer, more than any of the old rules allowed. And within the month, his boat went down in flat, calm water with no storm to blame it on. 2 of the 3 men on it never surfaced. Folks up and down that coast don't call it coincidence. They call it a debt getting collected. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm telling you nobody I know takes more than a can of food off her anymore, and hasn't in my lifetime. My own family has a thread run through this too, one I didn't know until I was older. My grandfather's brother worked the fur trade routes back before the war, and family word has it, he was meant to be aboard the Bachimo the season she got locked in the ice, and got pulled onto a different run at the last minute, by pure dumb luck. He never talked about her, wouldn't have her name said in his house. I used to think that was superstition. Now I think a man who almost got left behind on something like that has better reasons than the rest of us to keep quiet about it. The third time I saw her, I was alone, no crew, just me running a line back in from open water, later than I should have been out. No witnesses this time, nobody to back up what I saw, which is exactly why I did something foolish. I carved my initials into her rail the first time I'd boarded her, years back, a young man's stupid instinct to leave a mark on something that felt bigger than he was. This time, running up alongside her in the dark, I wanted proof for myself that it was really her, and not some story I'd built up bigger in my head than the truth deserved. I climbed aboard and went straight for that rail, and my initials were there, same as I'd left them. except they weren't the same. Someone had carved more into the wood around them. Letters and marks I hadn't made, extending off my own initials like somebody had picked up where I left off. Not vandalism, not random. Deliberate lines worked into mine like a conversation, like whoever did it had studied my carving and decided to add to it rather than cut their own mark somewhere else on that rail. That was the night I found the boot. Sitting by the stove in the galley, dry, recently oiled, a modern sole on it, the kind of tread you buy off a shelf today, not something that survived from 1931. Whoever left that boot there hadn't been dead for 80 years. Whoever left that boot there had been standing in that galley recently enough that the leather hadn't even stiffened up with the cold yet. I found the journal after that, tucked under a bunk mattress that had no business still holding its shape after so many decades of damp. Pages and pages of entries, dated across the years, decades apart from each other, and every single page in the same hand. Not a hand that had aged, not a signature that had gone shaky, the way a man's grip does over 50, 60 years of living. The same steady hand in 1940 as in 1990. Like time had simply declined to touch whoever was doing the writing. I went looking afterward. Once I was back on solid ground, through old newspaper clippings and company records. A friend of mine keeps, who spent years chasing this story harder than I ever wanted to. The official count of men airlifted off the Bechimo in 1931 comes up one short against the crew manifest, every single time you check it. One man, unaccounted for, no death recorded, no body, no family that stayed in the region long enough to ask questions. The name in that old ledger matched the name signed fresh in the logbook we found years before. Matched a name my friend had heard whispered by an old-timer as the one man who supposedly refused evacuation, who said the ship needed tending and someone ought to stay. What finally put a stop to my curiosity was where I found her the last time. Not drifting open water, not sitting in pack ice where a ship gets pushed by wind and current the way ships do. She was sitting still and quiet inside a frozen inlet, a channel with no navigable opening wide enough for a steamer her size. Water so shallow in places a small boat scrapes bottom. There is no explanation for how a vessel that size gets into water like that, without a hand on her wheel and an engine turning. None that I've ever heard hold up. The last thing I saw before I left her for good that night was a boot print in fresh snow on her deck, leading from the wheelhouse to the rail, and stopping there, like whoever made it had simply stepped off into the dark, or never needed to step anywhere at all. I didn't wait around to test which. I went back over the side, started my engine, and watched from open water as she pulled away from that inlet against a current that should have held her fast, moving off into the dark the same unhurried way she always does, like a man walking home who isn't in any rush because he already knows the way. I've told that story to enough people now that I've stopped waiting for somebody to tell me I'm wrong. What I think, and I don't say it easy, is that ship was never abandoned the way the company's books say she was. I think one man stayed aboard her, on purpose, and something about that choice kept him tied to her in a way none of us have a word for. I think every time she turns up, it's not the ship coming back into our world. It's that man, still keeping her. Still expecting one of us to climb aboard and find him there waiting. And so far he's only ever missed us by a season, by a tide, by however long it takes a man to hear a boat's engine coming and decide he isn't ready yet to be found. There's another story from further up that same coast, one I only heard secondhand from a man who swore every word of it was true, about a lighthouse keeper who spent 30 winters alone on a rock so far out that supply boats only reached him twice a year. No crew around him. No village to keep the story honest, the way we've kept the Bechimos. Just one man, one light, and something that came for him near the end that nobody was there to see coming. I watched her lights for 3 nights before I understood no one was steering her. The first night I didn't think anything of it. A schooner running late off the shipping lane isn't strange out here, not in autumn when the fishing boats push their luck before the season closes. I logged her position at 8:04 p.m., bearing northeast, running lights lit proper, red to port and green to starboard, and went back to my supper. Boats pass this station all the time. Most nights I don't even write them down unless they hail me. By the second night she hadn't moved on. Same rough position, Same 2 lanterns burning steady against the dark water, like she'd anchored just past the reef line and decided to sit there. I checked my charts. There's no good holding ground where she sat, nothing a captain with any sense would choose to anchor over. I told myself she was waiting out a tide, or nursing engine trouble, though schooners that size don't run engines worth nursing. By the 3rd night, I'd stopped guessing and started watching. I called down to the harbor master's office at the county seat, the kind of call you make more out of boredom than concern, and asked if anyone had a vessel matching her rig logged in or out of any port within a week's sail of here. Nothing. No transponder, no name filed, no captain who'd checked in anywhere along that stretch of coast in 7 days. That's when the feeling started. Not fear exactly. More like the sensation of counting something twice and getting 2 different numbers both times. I studied her that night through the glass longer than I should have, and that's when I understood what had been nagging at me since the first evening. She was running too close to the reef. Not reckless close, not a drunk hand at the tiller close. Close in a way that looked deliberate, like whoever held her course knew exactly where every rock sat and threaded her past all of them without slowing. No captain sails that line on purpose, unless he's done it 100 times, and nobody sails a stretch like that, 100 times, without me knowing his face. I tried the lamp on her, the old signal code, 3 long and a pause, asking for identification. No answer came back in words, but her running lights pulsed once, twice, in something close to the same rhythm I'd sent. A beat behind, like an echo bouncing off a wall that shouldn't have been there. I told myself it was coincidence. Ship's lights flicker, bulbs surge. I wrote it down anyway. I called the Coast Guard station 40 miles south the next morning, more formal this time. Gave them her bearing and description. The petty officer on the line sounded like a man who'd heard 100 keepers cry wolf over a fishing smack running dark instruments, and he told me as much, politely. No distress calls, no incident reports, nothing on their board matching a schooner in my sector. He said if she was still there in a few days to call back. She was still there. Every night that week. Same lanterns. Same position drifting only slightly with the current, before correcting herself, as if some hand kept nudging her back onto her mark. I started watching the sails instead of the hull, and that was worse. The wind shifted 3 separate times over those nights, hard enough that I had to lash down the gear on my own catwalk, and her canvas never moved. Not once. No slack, no luff, no trim. A sail that doesn't answer the wind isn't being sailed. It's just hanging there, dressed up to look like it is. What unsettled me most wasn't the ship herself, but the clock of her. She came on station at the same minute every dusk, near enough that I stopped needing my watch to know when to look up. And she was gone by first light every morning, vanished back into whatever she came from before the sun cleared the water. Weather never touched her schedule. Boats don't run on schedules like that. Tides do. Machines do. People don't. Not out here. Digging through the station archive on a hunch, I found a logbook from 3 keepers back, water-stained, half the pages fused together with age. One entry, dated some 40 years earlier, described a schooner that came and went off this same reef for the better part of a week before disappearing for good. The keeper who wrote it hadn't given her a name in his log, but a later hand, maybe the next keeper down the line, had scrawled a single word in the margin beside the entry. Nightjar. Under it, in different ink, someone else had written that it wasn't worth mentioning to the relief crews, that men who talked about her too much got moved off their stations early. I put in a formal request that day, and this time somebody listened. A rescue boat came out from the mainland to intercept her, 2 men and a harbor patrol officer, and I watched the whole approach from my tower, with my heart going harder than I wanted to admit. As they closed the last 100 yards, she changed heading. Not much, just enough to keep her stern angled away from them, the kind of small correction a hand makes without thinking. It was the first time in 8 nights I'd seen proof that something aboard her was choosing anything at all. They boarded her without much trouble in the end, because up close, she let them. What they found, they radioed back to me before they'd even finished the sweep below deck. No crew, not one soul, not a boot print in the wrong place, not a body in the water they could find with the light they had. But the stove in the galley was warm, a pot of something still holding its heat. 2 plates set out like supper had been called, and then simply abandoned mid-bite. No lifeboat missing from her davits. Whoever had been standing at that stove hadn't gone anywhere a boat could carry them. Below, wedged in a drawer that hadn't so much as rusted shut, they found her logbook. The last entry was dated that same day, hours before they'd climbed aboard, in a hand that stayed consistent page to page, and yet didn't. The letters tightening and loosening like the same man had written it in 3 different moods, spread across a single sitting. I read the transcript when they brought it back to my station, and that was when the ground genuinely went out from under me. The final entries described heavy weather, gale force wind out of the northeast, driving rain, a sea that had her taking water over the bow. I checked my own log without needing to, because I already knew what it would say, and it said what I knew it would. Calm that night, clear skies, light air, barely enough wind to stir the flag on my pole. I had written it myself, in my own hand, hours before the rescue boat ever launched. It didn't stop there. A researcher the county sent out, a patient woman who clearly did this kind of work more than she let on, matched the storm described in that logbook, nearly word for word, gust for gust, to an actual gale recorded in the Maritime Archive from decades back. The same storm that had, according to a single surviving insurance claim, taken a schooner named Nightveil down somewhere off this coast, with all hands lost. Not long after her, a man came out from a regional office, showed a badge, said he was there to run down the hull registration stamped into her transom. It took him 2 days to get an answer back over the radio. The number matched a vessel decommissioned and broken up for scrap parts more than 15 years earlier. Officially, whatever was tied up at my dock that week hadn't existed since before I'd taken this post. An old fisherman who worked the shoals near my station, a man who normally wouldn't give me more than a nod, sat with me one evening and told me, reluctant the whole time like the words cost him something, that this wasn't the first loop boat this stretch of water had seen. He said they came before real trouble, always had, going back further than his father's stories went, and that the smart thing, the thing every keeper before me had eventually learned, was to log it and say nothing more than you had to. That advice came too late. A slip of paper I wasn't meant to see, left behind by the regional man in his hurry to repack his case, showed a standing order older than my own service record, some kind of watch directive covering this whole coastline for what it called anomalous vessel returns. Someone, some office, had known about ships like her long before I ever climbed this tower, had been quietly tracking them for longer than I'd been alive, and had never once mentioned it to the man standing the actual watch. After that, I started noticing things about my own situation instead of hers. A car I didn't recognize idling at the turnoff to the station road 2 mornings running. A phone call from someone who introduced himself as a follow-up interviewer, and then asked questions that had nothing to do with the ship, and everything to do with my service history, my time off station, whether I'd ever missed a watch. I understood, slowly and without anyone saying it outright, that I'd stopped being the man reporting the strange thing and started being a piece of it myself. The lab that finally looked at the logbook paper came back with something that should have settled things, and instead did the opposite. The paper wasn't old, neither was the ink. Whatever hand had filled those pages had used stock you could buy at any stationer's within the last year, bound to look aged, weathered on purpose. Someone, or something, wearing the shape of someone, had written that whole account recently and dressed it up as a survivor's log from a ship that sank generations ago. That same week, going back through my own personal journal, the one I keep separate from the official station log, for my own head more than anything, I found 4 pages in my own handwriting that I had no memory of writing. Not wrong information, not nonsense, just entries in my own hand, my own turns of phrase, describing days I remembered living through differently than the page did. The same drift I'd seen in her logbook, tight, then loose, then tight again, like more than one version of me had held the pen. I tried to reach the regional investigator directly after that, wanting answers, and the office told me flatly that no one by his name or badge number had ever worked out of that district. The man who'd walked off my dock with the original logbook under his arm, the one who'd run down the hull number and told me the standing order existed, had never been who he said he was at all. Before he'd taken it, though, One of the rescue crew had photographed every page of that logbook on his own phone, more out of habit than instruction, and it was in those photographs, going through them alone at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, that I found the entry that finally broke something loose in me. Buried 3 pages before the final one, in the tightest version of that drifting hand, was my own name. Not a name close to mine, followed by a line about transfer orders coming through before the season turned. Orders I had not received. Orders that, as far as I knew, did not yet exist anywhere, in any office on land. They arrived 6 weeks later, worded close enough to that line in the logbook that I read them standing in my own kitchen, with my hands not quite steady. The schooner never came back after that last night the rescue boat boarded her. No lanterns off the reef, no clockwork dusk arrival, nothing. Just an empty stretch of water where something had run its course and stopped. I packed my gear and rode the tender off my station on the morning my relief came up the ladder, and I didn't look back at the light the way I thought I would. What I thought about instead, the whole way in, was that slip of paper the false investigator had left behind, that standing order older than my service record, and how many other keepers up and down this coast had logged the same lights, the same warm stove, the same impossible calm on nights their own written record swore was calm, and someone else's swore was a gale. Somewhere in a drawer in a federal building that doesn't officially exist any more than that hull number did, my name has joined a list I never agreed to be on. One line among what I now suspect are dozens, each of us certain, right up until we weren't, that what we'd seen was ours alone to explain. I watched her lights for 3 nights before I understood no one was steering her. The first night I took her for a lobsterman running late, some fool who'd forgotten to switch on his stern lamp until he caught my beam sweeping the water and remembered the rules. It happens more than people think. I logged her at 11:41 lantern, riding low along the outer edge of the ledge, moving north to south, and went back to my supper without another thought. The second night I almost didn't log her at all. Almost. But something about the timing snagged in my head while I was winding the clockwork that turns the lens. So I checked the harbor master's board over the radio the next morning, the way I do most mornings anyway, just to square my log against what was actually moving through these waters. There was nothing scheduled that night. No lobster boats working that stretch, no freight, no pleasure craft foolish enough to be out past dark on a falling tide. I told myself the board was wrong. Boards are wrong all the time. It was the third night that changed things. Because that night the moon was up enough that I finally got the glass on her properly, and what came into focus wasn't any boat that had business being out there. 2 masts, standing rigging instead of a wheelhouse. The kind of hull profile you see in old photographs on the wall of the Historical Society, not on the water. A schooner, and not a replica dressed up for tourists either, because tourist boats carry running lights bright enough to be seen from the mainland, and this one carried a single lantern, swinging faint and low, like it had been hung there and forgotten. I got on the radio to the Coast Guard station down the coast and gave them everything I had, her bearing, her rig, her lantern color. The man on the other end read back the board twice and told me there was nothing out there matching that description, nothing registered to make that run, and no distress called in from anywhere near my light. I remember sitting with the handset still warm in my palm, looking out at her, and thinking that a boat doesn't just not exist because a piece of paper says so. So I started timing her. That's the job, really. Timing things. And I'm good at it. After 11 years on this rock. 11:40 the first night. 11:41 the second. 11:40 on the third. Same course, same speed, same swing wide of the ledge before she came back around north again, like she was following a fence line only she could see. Currents don't work that clean. Wind doesn't either. A boat under sail drifts, corrects, fights the water a little every single time, and hers never did. She ran the same water the same way, night after night, like a groove worn into a record. What unsettled me more than her course was her silence. Any vessel passing this close to a manned light answers a signal lamp. It's just what you do. A courtesy older than any regulation. One long flash back to say, "I see you. Keeper. Thank you for the warning." I signaled her every night for a week. Not once did that lantern so much as flicker in response. It was the 4th or 5th night. I've lost the exact order by now. when she swung close enough, and the moon caught her stern square on, and I finally read the name across the transom through the glass. Nightjar, in paint gone the color of an old bruise. I called down to a woman I know at the County Historical Society the next morning, more out of habit than hope, and asked her to run the name against anything in the newspaper morgue. She called back that evening sounding strange, and told me a schooner by that name went down off this exact stretch of coast decades before I was ever posted here. All hands lost. No wreckage ever recovered. Not so much as a spar. I reported all of it up the chain. The sighting, the name, the history, expecting at minimum for someone to take it seriously. Instead, I got my supervisor on the line, asking gently how I was sleeping, whether I'd had any relief leave lately, whether I wanted him to send someone out to sit the light with me for a few nights. I understood what he was really asking. Men alone on rocks, for months at a stretch, see things. Everyone knows that, including me, which is the worst part. Because once someone else says it out loud, you start listening for it in your own head too. So I tried to make her undeniable. I got my old camera out and burned through most of a roll trying to catch her clean, but distance and low light and salt haze on the lens gave me nothing but smears of gray that could have been anything, could have been nothing at all. That failure cost me more than the Coast Guard's doubt had. I started keeping a second notebook just for her. Times to the minute, bearings to the degree, and that's how I caught the detail that finally scared me properly. She wasn't just running the same course. She was running it at the same minute, every single night, to the second as far as my old watch could tell me. Wind shifts, tide turns. Nothing on open water holds a schedule that tight except a train. I might have gone on alone with it a good while longer if Deke Ellery hadn't come up on the radio one morning, gruff as ever, asking if I'd seen anything strange working the ledge at night, because he had, 3 nights running, and he wasn't a man given to nerves or stories. 2 independent reports moved things in a way one man's word never could. Within 4 days, a boarding party came out from the mainland to intercept her on her next pass. They caught her just past midnight, and what they found when they went aboard was nothing anyone expected, not a ghost ship stripped and rotting, but a vessel that looked freshly worked. The galley stove was still warm. A kettle sat on the burner with water gone lukewarm inside it, like whoever had set it there had stepped away only minutes before. There was no one aboard, not a soul, not a body, not so much as a boot left behind. Both lifeboats sat secured in their davits, lashings tied off proper and tight. Every hatch below was dogged shut from the inside, which meant however the crew had left, they hadn't gone that way. They found the logbook in the captain's quarters, entries running in a steady hand right up through what should have been the final night, except the last confirmed port call recorded in those pages was dated a full 6 weeks before any of us had first seen her lantern on the water. 6 weeks of entries for a voyage nobody on land had any record of her ever starting. And then came the detail that undid something in me that I still haven't gotten back. The final entries described a hard blow that night, following seas, rigging strained, a storm worth writing home about. I had my own weather log open on the desk in front of me, while an officer read it to me over the phone, my own handwriting from that same night in front of my own eyes, and it said calm, clear, visibility good, wind under 5 knots. I'd logged it myself, hour by hour, the way I log every night of my life out here. Whoever wrote those pages had lived through a storm that, as far as the sky and sea and my own 2 eyes were concerned, never touched this coast. It only got worse from there. Though by then, I'd stopped expecting it to get better. A lab downstate ran the logbook's paper and came back with something the investigating officer read to me, like he didn't quite believe it himself. That the paper stock matched period manufacture from decades back, consistent with the ship's age, but the ink sitting on top of it, tested chemically fresh, laid down recently enough to still be within its shelf life. Old paper, new ink. Nobody could explain how you get one without the other. The registry search came back worse still. The hull number stamped into her keel matched a nightjar listed in an old marine insurance file as destroyed, paid out and struck from the books, years before any of us had laid eyes on her lantern. On paper, in ink far older than the ink in that logbook, she had already stopped existing. I went digging myself after that, back through the station's own archive, boxes of logs from keepers going back before my time, because if this had happened before, it would be written down somewhere, keepers being creatures of habit above all else. I found what I was looking for 2/3 of the way down a box, an account in a hand not mine, describing almost word for word what I'd been watching for a week, right down to the timing and the silence, in answer to the signal lamp. That log carried a name I recognized from the framed keeper roster on the station wall. A man who'd held this light decades back, and whose entry ended abruptly with no explanation in the official record beyond the words relieved of post, cause undetermined. I asked around enough to learn what that phrase usually meant in the old days, which was that a keeper had gone missing from his post, and nobody could say how or where, and the family had eventually stopped asking. The last thing the investigating officer told me, almost in passing, like it was a curiosity, rather than the center of everything, was that when they cross-referenced the old crew manifest recovered from the Nightjar's final voyage against the station's own personnel records, that missing keeper's name was sitting right there on the crew list, listed as having signed on for a ship he'd never once, in any surviving record, been assigned to sail. By the time I learned that, other lights up and down the coast had started calling in reports of their own, lanterns on empty water running courses that made no sense, all inside that same narrow stretch of days, like whatever had been circling my rock alone was in fact circling the whole coast at once, and I had simply been the first one paying close enough attention. They opened a file on it, finally, an actual case number, and when I sat for my formal interview, I made the mistake of asking the young officer taking my statement how long a case like this usually took to get assigned a number. He didn't quite meet my eyes when he told me that the number already existed before I ever made my first call, that it had been sitting open and quiet in a drawer somewhere, for longer than either of us had been alive. I asked him what that meant, and he didn't answer that part at all, just thanked me for my time and packed up his case, and I have not stopped thinking, every night since, alone with my lens turning above me, about who exactly has been keeping that file, and how long they knew, and why nobody thought to warn the men out here on the rocks watching the water for them. We chased that story for 2 years, and every source contradicted the last one. That's the line I kept coming back to, whenever an editor asked why it was taking so long, why the notebook kept getting thicker, while the actual draft kept shrinking. Most investigations move in one direction, even if it's slow. This one moved sideways, then backward, then sideways again. And somewhere in the second year, I stopped trying to draw a straight line through it, and just started writing down who said what, and exactly when they stopped saying it. By the end, that list of silences was longer than the story itself. And there's one detail near the very beginning of that list, something so small I almost didn't bother writing it down, that the whole case ended up turning on. I'll get to it. Just hold on to it. The ship was the MV Corvid's Rest, a bulk carrier registered under a shipping line out of Cyprus, running a route that cut through the Philippines, down through Panama, and back out into open water, on a loop that repeated every 6 weeks like clockwork. She'd made that same loop for years without a single flagged incident. Then, on a Tuesday in the middle of the Pacific, her transponder went dark. Not glitchy, not intermittent. Gone, completely, from every tracking system that should have had her, for 11 straight days. When she came back online, she wasn't anywhere near where she should have been. She was drifting 60 miles off her last known course. Engines idling. Nobody answering hails on any channel. When a response vessel finally got a boarding team aboard, there was no crew anywhere on that ship. Not in the galley, not in the berths, not on the bridge. And the cargo manifest sitting in the ship's own log didn't match the one filed with port authorities before she left dock. Somebody had changed the paperwork. The question was when, and who, and that question is what ate up 2 years of my life. The company's first statement blamed piracy. Clean, simple, forgettable. It fell apart inside a week, because nobody, not the Coast Guard, not the maritime insurance trackers who log every single incident in that stretch of ocean, could point to a single piracy event out there in over a decade. So I went to the insurer, and their private investigator handed me a completely different account. He told me the crew hadn't vanished mid-voyage at all. According to his information, they'd signed off the ship days before the transponder ever went dark. 2 versions of the same event. from two parties who should have agreed, and they flatly contradicted each other. I remember sitting in my car after that meeting thinking, this is either a very simple mistake or somebody upstream is lying, and I have no way yet to tell which. Then a port official in the Philippines gave me a third version, and this is the one I want you to remember, because it's the thread that eventually pulled the whole thing apart. According to the harbor logs he showed me, the Corvid's Rest never officially departed on the date the company claimed she did. The paperwork existed, the stamps were there, but nobody could produce the harbor pilot who was supposed to have guided her out past the breakwater that morning. I asked for his name. The official gave me one. I spent 4 months trying to find that man and never did. Not fired, not transferred, not dead as far as anyone could confirm, just absent from every record after that date, like he'd been written into the story only long enough to make the paperwork look complete. I got my hands on the crew manifest next, and the mismatch there was almost too clean to be an accident. 14 names on the ship's manifest. But the Maritime Labor Registry, the one seafarers use to log every contract they sign, showed 17 men had signed on for that specific voyage. 3 names existed on paper and nowhere else. No home address that checked out, no next of kin, no prior voyage history anywhere in the database. I want you to keep those 3 names in the back of your mind, because they resurface later, in a place I never expected. Digging into the ship's history, I found something the company had never disclosed to anyone. Not the insurer, not the flag registry, nobody. The Corvid's Rest had gone dark before. 6 days that time. 4 months earlier. Same general stretch of ocean, logged so quietly it barely registered as a footnote in a shipping database nobody thought to flag. This wasn't the first disappearance. It was the second. And once I knew that, the entire story stopped being about one bad voyage and started being about a pattern, one I still didn't understand. The cargo didn't add up either. The manifest listed machine parts, industrial components, nothing unusual. But when salvage investigators finally got around to weighing what was actually left in the hold, the tonnage was off by a wide enough margin to suggest something had been in there that was never written down on any document I could find. I sat with that number for a long time. It's the kind of gap that either means somebody made a very expensive mistake or somebody was moving something they never intended to declare. I found the wife of one of the ship's engineers, a woman named Nothing I'm going to repeat here, because of what happened to her later. She told me her husband had called her on a satellite phone 2 full days after the company's own timeline said the ship had already gone silent. That call should not have been possible if their version of events was true. Either someone had the dates wrong, or someone was deliberately lying about which dates mattered, and I remember thinking, this is the first piece of this story that isn't secondhand. This is a wife who heard her husband's voice. That has to mean something. A week after that interview, her number stopped working. Disconnected, no forwarding information, no new listing anywhere. I drove to the address I had for her. The apartment was occupied by someone else who'd never heard of her. I want to be honest with you. That's the moment this stopped feeling like a shipping story to me. That's the moment it started feeling like something with teeth. Around the same time, I got hold of the insurance filing, and this is where I thought, finally, I've found the motive. 6 weeks before the disappearance, the policy on the Corvid's Rest had been increased by nearly half its original value. That's the oldest play in maritime fraud. Overinsure the vessel, arrange for her to go down quietly, collect a payout that dwarfs what she was ever actually worth. I wrote half a draft around that theory. I was proud of that draft, except the ship never sank. She came back mostly intact, seaworthy, empty, but undamaged. No signs of sabotage below the waterline. Nothing consistent with a vessel that was ever meant to be lost at sea. Whatever this was, it wasn't insurance fraud, and I had to throw that draft away and admit I still had no idea what I was looking at. So I went further back into the registry records, and that's where the story really opened up into something I wasn't prepared for. In 18 months, the Corvid's Rest had been reflagged 3 separate times, moved through a chain of shell registries structured in a way that made her real. Legal ownership almost impossible to trace back to a single human being. I spent 6 weeks with a maritime lawyer just learning how to read those filings, and even she said she'd rarely seen a paper trail built this deliberately to go nowhere. When I finally did trace it, past the shells, past the nominee directors, the holding company sitting at the center of it all, connected directly to 2 other cargo vessels. Both of those ships had gone dark in the past 5 years and come back the exact same way. Crew gone. Manifests altered. Nobody ever arrested, nobody ever formally charged. This wasn't an isolated incident anymore. It was a pattern, with a body count made of ships instead of people, at least as far as anyone could prove at that point. And I want to be honest, that qualifier, at least as far as anyone could prove, is the sentence that kept me up more nights than almost anything else in this story. A man reached out to me out of nowhere, through an encrypted messaging app, claiming he'd been one of the missing crew from that first voyage. He said they hadn't been kidnapped, hadn't been rescued by anyone, hadn't been in danger at all. He said they'd been paid, in cash, to walk off the ship and disappear quietly, and never speak about it again to anyone, for any reason. I asked him why. He said he'd tell me more the next time we talked. There was no next time. The following day he called back and told me he'd never spoken to me before in his life, that I had the wrong number, that he had no idea what I was talking about. His voice was flat in a way that didn't sound like fear exactly. It sounded rehearsed. Then that number went dead too, and I added it to the growing list of people who'd said something true, and then unsaid it. A leaked Coast Guard log gave me something solid for the first time in months, something I could actually hold. A small, unregistered vessel had been spotted near the ship's drift coordinates. In the same window, she went silent. No follow-up report was ever filed on that sighting. Someone had let that thread go cold on purpose, and once I understood that, I stopped assuming incompetence was the explanation for anything in this case. That stretch of ocean, it turned out, wasn't just an empty shipping lane. It overlapped with a known smuggling corridor, flagged in more than one intelligence briefing for narcotics trafficking over the years. Suddenly, that missing tonnage in the cargo hold, the number I'd sat with for so long, meant something entirely different than a bookkeeping error. Then the port official, the one who'd first told me the departure paperwork was falsified, died in a traffic accident 3 days before he was scheduled to speak with me on the record. I'm not going to tell you what that means. I'm telling you what happened. And what happened is I stopped sleeping well after that, and I started saving every recording, every document, in 3 separate places, because I no longer trusted that anything I had was safe just sitting on my laptop. My own records requests started coming back redacted, or lost, or simply unanswered. Agencies that had cooperated with me a year earlier, suddenly citing procedures they'd never mentioned before. My editor got a call from a lawyer neither of us had ever heard of, suggesting, very politely, that this story wasn't worth the paper's exposure. We almost dropped it. I want to be honest about that. There was a real meeting, in a real conference room, where killing the story was the recommendation on the table, and then a source inside the insurer's own salvage team sent me a file that changed everything. And this is the part I still think about more than any other. Recovered footage from the ship's internal security cameras, the same cameras the company had sworn under oath were non-functional for the entire voyage. The footage showed the crew, all of them, walking off the ship, in open ocean, hundreds of miles from any land. Single file. Calm. Unhurried. No lifeboat was ever launched. No raft was deployed. Nothing on that footage was consistent with an emergency of any kind. Men just walked toward the rail, one after another, and stepped out of frame like they were stepping off a city bus at the end of a shift. When we had that footage forensically analyzed, the embedded timestamp didn't match the ship's official log by more than 30 hours. Either the footage had been altered after the fact, or the entire recorded timeline of that voyage was a fiction, built to cover something that actually happened a full day and a half earlier than anyone had ever admitted to. And then, in the background of a single frame, cleaned up and enhanced by a forensic video analyst we'd hired specifically for this, there's a figure standing on the upper deck, who isn't crew at all. My analyst matched his build and his stance, cautiously, to a financial backer of the parent holding company, a man I had been trying to reach for the better part of a year, a man who had never once returned a single call. Once we saw that, everything underneath it stopped looking like negligence, or fraud gone sideways, or a crew that panicked and made a terrible decision in open water. The altered manifest, the falsified departure log, the 3 names that existed only on paper, the reflagging through shell after shell. None of it was chaos. It was construction. Someone had built this disappearance on purpose, piece by piece, well enough that 2 governments and 1 insurance company spent the better part of a year investigating 3 completely different, entirely fabricated versions of what actually happened to that ship. And then the same walking pattern, that same unhurried single-file exit toward the rail, turned up again, this time in a few seconds of grainy dashcam-style footage tied to one of the other 2 vessels owned by that same holding company, which meant the Corvid's rest was never really a mystery on her own. She was one instance, one performance, of something that had already happened before her, and that, unless somebody stopped it, was very likely going to happen again on some other ship, under some other name, to some other crew, whose families would spend 2 years being told 3 different lies. At that point, I stopped chasing the paperwork and the men who kept changing their stories every time I got within reach of them. I went looking for the one person in this entire case who hadn't spun a single theory the whole time, someone who'd only ever described what he could put his hands on, and nothing more. That search took me to a diver who'd worked the salvage inspection on the hull before any of this ever made the news, back when the Corvid's Rest was still just an empty ship, sitting low in gray water, waiting for somebody to explain her. I climbed aboard expecting a routine tow job, and I found a table set for lunch. That's usually where people stop me and ask questions, so let me walk you through it properly, in the order it actually happened, because the order is what makes this one different from every other job I've worked in 30 years on the water. Easter of 2007, off the far north Queensland coast, right along the edge of the Great Barrier Reef, a charter skipper radioed in that he'd spotted a catamaran sailing in slow, useless circles about 20 nautical miles out. Sails up, nobody answering hail after hail on the radio. Coast Watch called it a probable medical situation. Somebody collapsed below deck, maybe, unable to reach the wheel. That's the job I was briefed for. Get aboard, check on the crew, call it in, tow her back if the engine had died. The engine hadn't died. That was the first thing that didn't sit right, even before I was out of the water. I could hear it idling clean and steady from 50 meters off, running like it hadn't missed a beat in days, which, it turned out, it hadn't. I went up the swim ladder at the stern, and the first thing in front of me was the cockpit table, plates out, bread half sliced, a laptop open on the bench, screen still glowing, some marine forecast page pulled up, like someone had been standing there checking tomorrow's weather and simply stepped away mid-thought. Except nobody steps away from that. Not clean, not without a trace. I called out twice. Nothing came back but a loose sheet line slapping against the mast, a sound that still gets under my skin now, years on, whenever a halyard clangs against something metal in a marina at night. 3 men had left port 2 days earlier. Not weekend tourists either. Proper sailors. The kind who'd made that same crossing a dozen times before without incident. And somewhere between then and the moment I stepped over that rail, all 3 of them had simply stopped existing on that boat. No mayday had gone out. Not a burst of static, not a half word. Nothing logged by any station monitoring that stretch of coast. For a working radio on a boat that size, that alone should have been close to impossible. But it gets stranger than that. The sails were still properly trimmed, catching wind, which meant the autopilot had been steering her by itself for the better part of a full day. 20-some hours with nobody at that wheel, and the boat had just kept doing what it was told to do, holding a course nobody living was choosing anymore. The bread wasn't stale. It hadn't curled or dried the way food does after a day baking in tropical sun. Whatever had happened fast, and it had happened while lunch was still fresh enough to eat. Every life jacket on board was exactly where it belonged, stowed, dry, untouched. Whatever took those 3 men didn't arrive as a crisis anyone saw coming. You don't reach for a jacket in a panic and then fold it neatly back into its locker. The fuel tank was running close to empty, which, once you do the maths, tells you the engine had been left running unattended for that entire missing stretch of time. Nobody had shut it off. Nobody had been in a position to. And then there were the glasses. A pair of reading glasses, folded, sitting square in the center of the rail cap at the stern, like someone had taken them off to squint out at the water and set them down mid-sentence, fully meaning to pick them straight back up. The empty cabins felt wrong in a broad, general way. Those folded glasses felt wrong in a very specific one, because folding your glasses is a small, deliberate, unhurried act. Nobody in the middle of losing their life does that. We searched for 6 days straight after that. Aircraft, patrol boats, current modeling, volunteer vessels, the full weight of it, across thousands of square kilometers of some of the most watched, most fished water in the country. We found nothing. Not a shoe, not a strap of clothing, nothing that a body in warm reef water almost always leaves behind, even on the occasions where the body itself is never recovered. The weather ruled out the easy explanation before the search had even properly started. No storm system, no rogue wave event. Seas were 1.5 meters, maybe 2 at their worst, which on that stretch of coast is an unremarkable Tuesday, not a freak occurrence. What we did find, once investigators went over the boat properly, was a fishing line trailing off the stern, snagged hard around the propeller shaft. The ordinary kind of tangle that usually just means someone swears under their breath, grabs a knife, and leans out over the back to cut it free. And right where you'd brace a knee to lean over that transom, there was a scuff. Fresh. The kind of scrape you get from a wet boot sliding fast across a non-slip surface. Not from months of ordinary wear. One scuff mark. One man's foot, most likely. In the half-second before he went into the water. Here's where the simple version of the story stopped making sense to me. And it's worth sitting with, because it's the part most retellings skip straight past. If one man goes over reaching for a snagged line, the other two don't just vanish along with him. They shout. They cut the throttle. They turn the boat, throw a life ring, get on the radio. Somebody survives to describe what happened. That is not what we were looking at. All 3 were gone. Clean. And the boat had simply kept sailing itself in a straight, patient line for nearly a day afterward, obedient to nobody. Which meant whatever took the first man had very likely taken the second man going in straight after him, and whatever took the second man had taken the third. Before you write it off as pirates, or something taken from them, I'll save you the theory, because investigators chased it too. Wallets still in the cabin. Phones still on the charger. Cash untouched. The laptop, worth taking on its own, sitting open on the bench exactly where it had been left. Whoever, or whatever, emptied that boat of 3 men wasn't interested in anything they owned. Sharks got floated in the papers within days, the way they always do. No blood anywhere on that boat. No torn gear, no damage to the stern rail, nothing beyond 1 scuff mark and 1 snagged line. A carbon monoxide leak from the generator got floated too, and that one actually made sense on paper for about a day, until it didn't, because a leak like that takes down whoever's on board and leaves them on board. It doesn't clear a boat of 3 grown men and then let the engine run flawlessly for another 20 hours straight. I want to tell you something that happened to me years before that job, because it's the only reason any of this ever made real sense to me. I was crewing a mate's boat further south, pulling craypots before sunrise. Nothing special. I leaned out over the stern to clear a pot fouled on the swim step. 1 hand on the rail, 1 on the rope, and a swell came through that I never saw coming. Not big, not dramatic. Just the wrong timing, meeting the wrong footing at the wrong second. My boot went first. My hand followed half a beat later, because the rail was wet and my grip wasn't what I thought it was. I was in the water before I'd even finished the thought that I was falling. What saved me wasn't strength, and it wasn't really luck either. My mate was 2 meters away and heard the splash over the engine noise, and he was quick, and the water was warm enough that shock didn't hit before he got a line to me. Maybe 40 seconds, start to finish. 40 seconds between standing on a boat deck and becoming a story somebody tells at a bar for the rest of their life. 40 seconds is nothing. It's less time than it's taken me to tell you about it just now. And that's what I keep landing back on with the Kaz 2. 3 capable, experienced men, gone in a window that small, one after the other, with nobody left aboard to hear a splash over an idling diesel and a wind slapping canvas against a mast. If the first man went in chasing that line and called out, and the second went to grab him and got taken by the same swell off the same wet transom, that's 2 men gone inside a minute. And if the third saw both of them go under and did exactly what almost any of us would do without stopping to think it through, which is go in after the people he cared about, That's 3 men lost before any of them were ever within reach of a radio 4 meters away. None of them were clipped to anything. No harnesses, no tethers. On a calm day, on a boat they knew inside out, doing a job they'd done 100 times before without a second thought, nobody thinks to clip on. That's not carelessness. That's just what familiar water does to a person's sense of risk over enough years. The coronial inquest, more than a year later, landed on some version of that as the most probable sequence of events. Not a certainty, because there was no witness, no recovered body, nothing but a scuff mark, a tangled line, an untouched cabin, and physics doing the arguing. Accidental drowning, most likely triggered at the stern, with the currents along that stretch of the reef finishing what the water started before help ever had a chance to reach them. But a finding on paper isn't the same thing as knowing, and that gap never really closes for the people who were actually standing on that deck afterward. There's one detail I've never put in an official statement, and I still don't love saying it out loud now. Before the photographer got out to log the scene properly, I picked those glasses up off the rail. Just for a second. I couldn't tell you exactly why. Some part of me wanted to know if they were still warm, which is a strange, illogical thing to want to know, and they weren't, obviously. They were just glasses that had been sitting in the tropical sun, same as everything else on that deck. I set them back down exactly where they'd been before anyone else stepped aboard. It changed nothing about the investigation, but I've carried the fact that I was the only person who ever touched the last thing one of those men set down before he went over that back rail. No bodies were ever recovered, not in the 6 days we searched, and not in the years since, as far as I've ever heard. The Kaz-2 herself was eventually repaired, sold on, and sailed under a different name by people who, from what I understand, had no idea what they'd bought until somebody told them. I still take tow jobs, still climb aboard boats that radio in with something not quite right, an engine that's cut out, a skipper gone quiet on the channel longer than he should be. 9 times out of 10 it's nothing, a flat battery, a bloke asleep at the wheel after too many hours on the water. Ordinary, forgettable stuff that makes you feel a little foolish for the knot that had tightened in your stomach on the way out. But every so often I climb over a rail onto a boat that's running fine, sailing fine, everything squared away and shipshape, and there's nobody there to meet me on deck. And for 1 second, before the rest of my head catches up, I brace myself for a table set for 3. I was supposed to be on that crossing, and the only reason I wasn't is a head cold. Not even a bad one. It came on fast, faster than colds usually do. Somewhere between lunch and the 4 o'clock shift call, and I remember thinking it was strange, because I'd felt fine all day, and then in about 20 minutes, I was sweating through my shirt with my head pounding, like someone had their thumb pressed behind my eye. The dock foreman took one look at me and told me to go home. I argued with him. We were already short 2 men that week, and pulling me meant somebody else had to pick up my slot on top of their own watch. That somebody was Tomas Halloran, 26 years old, saving for a wedding ring he hadn't told his girlfriend about yet. He clapped me on the shoulder on his way to sign the log, and told me to drink soup and stop being a baby about it. That was the last thing he ever said to me. What I didn't know that night, and wouldn't find out for months, was that I wasn't the only one who'd gotten sick like that in the days before. 2 other men on 2 earlier crossings that same week had come down with the same sudden headache, the same wave of nausea, right around the same point in the trip, out past the halfway buoy where the water runs deep and the shoreline disappears behind you. At the time, nobody connected it to anything. Sick is sick. It's only later, once you're looking for patterns, that you start writing dates on a calendar and staring at them. The Winter's Belle left the dock at 6 that evening, under about as calm a sky as this lake ever gives you. No wind worth mentioning. No storm cell anywhere on the radar for 200 miles. The kind of night the old captains call flat water, and not always as a compliment, because flat water on this lake can mean the lake is resting, or it can mean the lake is holding its breath, and you don't always know which until it's over. Radio checks came in normal for the first hour and a half. Position, heading, nothing out of place. Then on the 2-hour check, dispatch said the voice on the other end just sort of trailed off mid-sentence, the way a word does when you're falling asleep saying it, not the way a radio cuts when a mast goes down or water hits the electronics. It faded, like the boat had simply sailed out of range of something. Except there was no reason for that. Not on that route. Not with that equipment. The Coast Guard had boats moving within the hour. I want to be clear about that, because a lot of these stories get told like everyone was asleep at the wheel, and that's not what happened here. Response was fast. Search patterns were textbook, and after the first full day of running grid lines over open water, they had found exactly nothing. No debris, no oil sheen, which is the part that used to keep me up at night, because a ferry that size carries enough fuel that even a clean sinking leaves a slick on the surface for days. There was none, not a drop. 4 days in, a trawler pulled up a scrap of hull, plating with paint on it, and for about 6 hours, everybody thought that was it. That was the confirmation. And then the lab came back and said the paint formula didn't match anything ever used on the Winter's Belle. Wrong ship, wrong story. Just another piece of junk this lake had been holding on to for who knows how long. A commercial fisherman came forward about a week after that and said he'd been running his nets not far off the crossing lane that same night, and he'd seen running lights out on the water, moving at a clip, but he never heard an engine. He wasn't the type to dress it up. He told the investigators exactly that, and nothing more, and it went into a file, and it sat there. Then the rumors started doing what rumors do. Somebody found out Captain Rundquist had taken a second mortgage out on his house that spring, and for about 2 weeks, half the town had convinced themselves this was insurance fraud, a scuttled ship, a payoff, the whole thing. It fell apart fast once the truth came out. The mortgage was for his daughter's hospital bills. The insurance policy on the vessel was standard, nothing inflated, nothing recent. Rundquist wasn't hiding anything, except how scared he was about money, same as half the men on that boat. Almost a year later, a garbled recording of the ferry's last radio traffic got handed over to a sound engineer who wanted to see if he could clean it up. Underneath the static, once he filtered it down, there was a low pulsing sound running the whole length of the tape. Not the engine, not interference. A thrum, steady, almost like a heartbeat if a heartbeat could hum. And when he ran it against an old NOAA recording from a different ship on a different part of the lake years earlier, a ship that had a bad scare but made it home, the two pulses matched close enough that it wasn't a coincidence anymore. That sent people digging back through old maritime records. And buried in a filing cabinet somewhere was a report from decades before the Winter's Belle even existed. A different vessel, same lake, same narrow stretch of crossing, same flat, calm water, gone in a single night with no wreckage ever recovered. 2 disappearances, decades apart, same conditions. Once you have 2, you start looking for a third pattern instead of a coincidence, and what turned up was pressure data. Both nights had shown a sudden, sharp drop in atmospheric pressure right before the vessels lost contact, the kind of drop that can generate what's called a meteotsunami, a wave built entirely out of air pressure, with no wind or storm required to produce it. It's real. It's documented on these lakes, and for a while it felt like an answer. Except a meteotsunami throws boats around. It capsizes them. It drives them into shoals. It leaves wreckage bobbing on the surface for searchers to find within days. It does not erase a 150-foot ferry down to nothing. So the theory explained the weather and explained nothing else, and the file went cold again, the way these things do, for years. It was a retired sonar technician, a man who'd spent 30 years reading lakebeds for a living, and couldn't let this one go, who finally put his own money into a private side-scan survey of the entire original search grid, decades after everyone else had stopped looking. He ran it twice to be sure of what he was seeing, and what he found was nothing. Not a broken hull, not a debris field, not so much as a scattered plate. After all those years of assuming the wreck was simply too deep or too silted over to have been found yet, the sonar came back clean across the whole search area, like the ferry had never been there at all. He didn't stop. He widened the search well past where anyone had bothered looking before, and out past the edge of the old grid he found something that hadn't been on any chart. A long depression cut into the lake bed, a scarp, the kind of feature you get from an underwater landslide. Core samples pulled from that depression dated the disturbance to the exact same week the Winter's Belle vanished. And when researchers laid the new lakebed survey over charts made before that week, the stretch that was now a scarp had been flat, ordinary lake floor. The terrain itself had changed that night. Geologists looking at the sediment cores found signs consistent with methane venting, gas escaping from destabilizing sediment before a slope gives way, which lines up close enough with a low humming sound that nobody who heard it in those final days thought twice about at the time. Not a warning anyone could have read. Just the lake quietly failing underneath itself while men kept crossing it like they always had. It sounded, for one clean week, like the whole thing had finally closed. A slow geological failure, a slope collapsing under gas pressure, a vessel caught over it at exactly the wrong hour of exactly the wrong night. No fault, no crime, nothing hiding in the water. Just bad luck, stacked on top of bad timing. Then somebody checked the position of that scarp against the Winter's Bell's actual logged course, and it didn't line up. The landslide sat well off to the side of where the ferry should have been running. If the ship had gone down in that collapse, it would have had to drift there afterward, and a 150-foot hull doesn't drift itself onto a lakebed feature and then vanish inside it without leaving a trace on the way. The geology explained a hole in the lake floor. It never explained where the ship actually went. So the case reopened, quietly, the way these things do when nobody wants to admit out loud that they're starting over. And going back through the original boarding log against every family claim ever filed in the decades since, someone finally noticed what nobody had thought to check before. The manifest listed one more name than any family had ever come forward to claim. One more person on that boat than anyone has ever been able to account for. No next of kin, no employment record before that week, no photograph on file anywhere. Just a name on a log, on a ship that isn't sitting anywhere it should be, on a lake that has never given any of it back. I don't chase the sonar reports anymore. I don't sit up running the pressure charts against the old radio tape the way I did for years. What I do now is simpler. I still work this lake. I still cross that same stretch of water some mornings. And I keep a coat on the hook by the wheelhouse door, heavier than I need for most weather. Because the one thing I learned from all of this is that the lake decides who gets to leave and who doesn't. And it never tells you why in advance. I stopped needing an answer. I just needed to still be standing on the deck when it was over. And I am. That's the part I hold on to. Not the mystery. The staying. We boarded expecting a routine health inspection and found every cabin door standing open. The Nightveil came into the outer roads 4 days after her scheduled arrival, running dark on the radio for all 4 of them. Harbor Control had her on radar the whole time, sitting 12 miles off the breakwater, with her engines turning over at exactly the RPM you'd use to hold station in a current, not idling rough the way a neglected engine room runs, but held steady, the kind of steady a chief engineer dreams about and rarely gets. Nobody was answering hails. Nobody was answering the searchlight signals either. When the pilot finally went out to bring her in, the ship came about and lined up on the channel with a precision that made him radio back and ask who was on the helm, because whoever it was had just threaded a beam that most captains take 2 tries to make. He told me afterward that the strangest part wasn't the maneuver itself. It was that nobody on the bridge wing waved back when he raised a hand in greeting, though he'd have sworn, just for a second, that he saw someone standing there. The gangway was already lowered when we came alongside. Not lowered badly, not left hanging. Set, locked, ladder down, exactly the way a deck officer sets it for boarding. Except there was no deck officer. There was no one on the rail to take our lines. I've done hundreds of boardings in this job, and every one of them starts the same way, with someone leaning over that rail to meet you. That absence, more than anything else that followed, is the thing that still sits wrong with me. It should have been the worst part of the night. It wasn't even close. Inside, the ship wasn't abandoned looking. It was clean. A housekeeping cart sat parked in the middle of B deck with a vacuum still running, its bag long since maxed out and blowing dust back into the carpet, like whoever pushed it had simply let go of the handle mid-stroke. Beside it, face down on the carpet, was a name tag, plastic, laminated, the kind crew wear clipped to a lapel, and when we turned it over, the name on it didn't match anyone on the crew manifest. Not a misprint, not a nickname. A name that, as far as our records ever showed, had never belonged to anyone employed on that ship. In the main dining room, the tables were laid for dinner service. Cloth, silver, glassware, wine already poured and gone flat in the glasses, plates full and untouched. My second officer counted the place settings out of habit. 904. The manifest said 900 passengers boarded that crossing. 4 settings too many. At 4 tables scattered with no pattern we could find. And at every one of those 4 extra settings, a phone sat face up on the table. Screen dark, battery dead, each one showing dozens of unanswered messages queued from family members on shore, who had apparently kept texting for days after the silence began, never once getting a reply, never once getting an error that the number didn't exist. There was no blood anywhere, no broken furniture, no sign that 904 people had done anything but stand up from dinner at the same moment. And yet every life jacket in every cabin was still in its cabin, save one, which we found neatly folded and placed in the captain's chair on the bridge, as if set there deliberately for someone who hadn't come to collect it. We checked the muster stations next, because that's protocol when you can't account for souls aboard, and every lifeboat was still in its davit, tallied, none deployed, none missing. Whatever had happened, nobody had abandoned ship in the way a ship gets abandoned. The bridge log should have told us something. It told us too much. Entries continued for all 4 missing days. Course corrections, weather notes, watch changes, written in a single hand that our forensics people later matched to the second officer's own handwriting sample from his personnel file. Routine, competent, boring entries, right up until the last one. Written by a man who, according to every other piece of evidence on that ship, hadn't been there to write them. What our handwriting analyst didn't tell us until weeks later, almost as an aside, was that the pressure and slant of the pen strokes changed subtly partway through the second day's entries, as though 2 different people had learned to write exactly the same hand, trading off without either one ever making a mistake the other would have made. We pulled the GPS track expecting a drift pattern, the kind of loose meander a derelict makes on wind and current. Instead, we got a closed loop, 40 nautical miles off the coast, the same tight circle traced over and over for 96 hours. Like something had been holding station and waiting. It was only much later, when an analyst overlaid every pass on top of each other, instead of looking at them one at a time, that she noticed the loop wasn't perfectly repeating. Each pass was a few hundred meters different from the last, tightening, orbit by orbit, toward a single point that the ship never quite reached before the tracking data cut out for good at the 96-hour mark. In the children's playroom, a puzzle sat half-finished on a low table, a jigsaw of a lighthouse missing maybe 30 pieces, a small chair pushed back, like someone had just stepped away from it. Near the toy shelf, though, someone had swept up a spill of broken glass into a neat pile in the corner, a small, deliberate act of tidiness that didn't square with a room full of children who'd apparently vanished mid-play. Underneath that same table, when we flipped it to check for damage, someone had scratched a single name into the wood, with what looked like a fingernail or the corner of a puzzle piece. It wasn't a child's name from the manifest. We ran it against every passenger and crew list twice. Cabin by cabin, we found wallets on nightstands, phones on chargers, passports in drawers, wedding rings sitting in dishes by the sinks. Whatever took 904 people off that ship, it didn't take anything they'd have needed to start a new life somewhere. In one cabin, we found a small stack of postcards, stamped, addressed, ready to be dropped in a mailbox at the next port, the handwriting cheerful and ordinary, describing a crossing that read like any other. One of them was addressed to a woman whose name we later confirmed, through a public obituary, had died 3 years earlier. The passenger who wrote it had no obvious connection to her that anyone in his family could explain when we asked, and none of them could explain why he'd have written to her at all. In another cabin, the safe was standing open, cash untouched inside it, and when we pulled its electronic log, it showed the safe had been opened and relocked 6 separate times over the course of the 4 days. Someone, or something, had kept moving through that ship long after the dining room went cold. What the log couldn't tell us, but the contents did, was that each time the safe was opened, one more identical brass key had been added inside it, until there were 6 of them sitting in a small pile on top of the cache. None of the ship's locks, as far as our engineers could determine, matched them. The medical log was clean. Nothing reported in the 72 hours before the silence started. No illness, no incidents. Signed off by the ship's doctor with a clean bill of health. It was only when we found her personal notebook, tucked in a drawer separate from the official file, that the story cracked a little. She'd written 2 nights earlier about a stomach bug moving through steerage. Nothing serious, but something she'd meant to log and hadn't. Someone had filed a clean report over her actual concerns, and we never found out who. The notebook itself was missing its last written page, torn out cleanly along the spine, and whatever she'd written there, the last thing she ever put on paper, as far as we know, has never turned up. We pulled the security footage next, and for hours it showed exactly what you'd expect. Empty corridors, nobody home. Then one of my team noticed a woman in a blue cardigan crossing 6 different cameras at 6 different times, always at the same minute past the hour, over and over, hours apart on the same monitor bank. Not long after, a second figure turned up on a different bank entirely. A man in an officer's uniform, walking a stretch of corridor near the engine room, at a time when the duty roster showed no officer assigned anywhere near there. It wasn't a ghost in the footage. It was worse in a duller way. The timestamp metadata across the whole system had corrupted at some point during the crossing, and nobody could tell us anymore which minute was real, or whether the woman and the officer had ever actually crossed paths with each other at all. Down in the radio room, nothing was broken. Every set had been powered down properly, channel by channel, in the correct shutdown sequence a trained operator uses to secure the room. Not a scramble, not sabotage. A checklist followed to the letter, by somebody who then never turned anything back on. Buried in the last hour of transmission logs before the shutdown, though, was a short burst of data on a frequency the ship had no equipment rated to use. We handed it to a signals lab. They came back 8 weeks later, told us they'd been able to confirm it was structured, not noise, and declined to tell us anything else, citing a classification we weren't given clearance to ask about. The ship's electrical log showed one more thing nobody could explain. A power draw at 0347, 4 days into the silence, that spiked to nearly triple the vessel's total rated capacity and lasted 90 seconds before dropping back to baseline. There was no equipment aboard that could pull that kind of load. And when we finally went cabin to cabin checking clocks, bedside clocks, galley clocks, the elevator control panels, a child's digital watch left charging on a dresser, every single one of them, without exception, was stopped at 0347. That should have been the strangest fact in the file. It wasn't the last one. Shoreside, the Coast Guard pulled data from 3 weather buoys along that stretch of coast and found a gap in their recordings at the same minute. 3 instruments miles apart going dark together for no logged reason. 2 commercial vessels that had been within radar range that night reported the same thing independently when we tracked them down. Compasses spinning, radar blanking for under 2 minutes, right around 0347 on a night when nothing in the weather or the water explained it. A third vessel, further off, logged a distress call on the emergency channel at that same minute, a voice reciting a ship's name and position that turned out, when someone finally cross-referenced it, to belong to a vessel lost in that same stretch of water more than 60 years earlier. Nobody has ever explained how that transmission got onto a modern channel, or why it stopped exactly when it did. Going back through the departure manifest, we found 4 passengers who'd boarded on paper tickets bought in cash. No names that matched anything in the booking system, no trace of who they were. A dock worker at the port of origin remembered a family of 4 coming up the gangway right before the ship sailed, and remembered, more specifically, that the security footage from that exact stretch of gangway was the only footage from that whole day that came back full of static. Weeks into the follow-up, a 5th cash ticket surfaced in a box of unlogged paperwork nobody had thought to check, sold at the same counter, on the same day, under a name that turned out to belong to a passenger who had sailed on a different ship entirely 3 years before, a ship whose file none of us had reason to know about yet. It was an insurance auditor, weeks into the investigation, who found that sister ship, a vessel from the same builder, decommissioned 3 years earlier after what her owners had quietly settled as a mechanical incident. No further details on public record. When we got a court order for the file, the timeline read almost the same as ours. Smaller scale, far fewer people involved. but the same signature. And in that file, buried in an appendix nobody had thought worth flagging at the time, every clock on that vessel had also stopped at 0347. Different ship, different ocean. 3 years apart, the same minute. Chasing the number itself got us nowhere useful until a maritime historian we consulted almost as an afterthought pointed out that 0347 was the recorded time of loss on a wreck from decades earlier, in almost the exact shipping lane the Nightveil had been circling for 4 days. He said it plainly enough, and then added, more quietly, that it was the third file he'd been shown in his career with that same number attached to it, before catching himself and telling us he'd rather not say any more about the other two. We could never prove any of it mattered. We also could never make it stop mattering. 10 days after we sealed the ship, the passengers started turning up. Not bodies, people, alive, found wandering in small coastal towns up and down the coast, disoriented, unable to say how they'd gotten there, no memory past the last dinner service aboard. It happened 1 or 2 at a time over the following week and a half, never in groups, always near open water. One woman was reunited with her family, 3 towns north of the port, and by every account, it should have been the one clean, happy ending in the whole file. Her husband told investigators, almost apologetically, that their daughter looked to him like she'd grown 2 years in 10 days, tall enough that none of her clothes fit anymore, and that his wife hadn't seemed to notice the difference at all. When investigators interviewed the returned passengers, the accounts lined up in a way that should have been reassuring, and instead was the opposite. Every one of them described going home normally after the voyage. Days of ordinary life that phone records and bank statements proved never happened. Shown the evidence, most of them didn't waver. They corrected us instead, patiently, the way you'd correct someone about a fact they'd simply gotten wrong. The last one found was the captain, sitting on a public bench near the harbor, in uniform, 4 days almost to the hour after we'd first searched his empty ship. He wasn't confused like the others. He was calm and mildly irritated, and he told the officers who found him that he'd never left the bridge, that his whole crew was still aboard and accounted for, and that it was the boarding team who'd disappeared that night, not his passengers. His uniform, the officers noted without quite knowing what to do with the detail, was pressed and dry, despite 10 days with no laundry service running and a storm that had soaked half the harbor front that same week. I still have my incident report from that boarding. Filing it required pulling the timestamp off my body-worn camera to match against my written log, standard procedure, nothing I'd ever had a reason to think twice about before. The camera clock puts me aboard the Nightveil for 11 minutes longer than I remember being there. My watch, the one I was wearing that night, has been sitting in an evidence bag on my desk ever since, because nobody's found a reason yet to release it back to me. I haven't asked for it back. I know what it says. It stopped at 0347, same as all the others, and I have never once managed to convince myself that it was already broken before I stepped onto that ship. Some nights my phone still rings at that exact minute, and when I pick it up there's nothing on the other end but a long, patient silence, the kind that feels like it's waiting for me to say something first. I never do.